Hey everyone, welcome to Unique Ways with Thomas Gerard, an audio podcast. Got a really great guest on today. He's IBM's design principal for applied AI and a master's graduate from the cool but short-lived Interaction Design Institute in Ivrea, Italy. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Noessel. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are you ready for 20 questions?
I am ready for the 20 questions.
Great. Question one, tell me a little bit more about yourself. What do you do?
I am a bit of a polymath. There are a lot of domains that where I've got some expertise. My undergrad at the University of Houston was in graphic design, though I've never been, I wouldn't call myself like great at graphic design. My grad degree, as you mentioned in the intro from Ivrea, is in interaction design, and that I feel really suits me and my capabilities. But professionally, I do product design, design strategy. Both of my last jobs sort of ask me to do enablement, meaning teaching other designers and establishing patterns that other designers can use. And the last like 10 years of my career have really been focused on design for AI. I'm a nonfiction author, written a bunch of books, almost all about design, one about sci-fi and technology in sci-fi that I co-authored with Nathan Shedroff. I wrote a book on pair design, which was co-authored with Gretchen Anderson. I wrote a book on agents before they were a big deal. And I'm currently working on a book for designing for assistants. I've also published some short stories around science fiction. And I do a lot of public speaking, and I keep a blog that was kind of related to the Make It So stuff called sci-fi interfaces.com. So generally, I'm a nerd, and that plays itself out in a number of different ways.
Great, sounds good. And just a note for the audience, if you guys are interested in related, really big episodes, check out the one with Don Norman. Question two, what's a key piece of knowledge that makes you different?
It this was a tough question to answer, partially because it feels like sort of arrogant to proclaim oneself as different. But if I when I really put my brain to it and thought about it, I think I have a willingness to look in places for insight that many people would sort of like poo-poo and say, no, 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 that's a dumb place. I'm not going to go there. One example is years ago. Holy cow. Yeah, decades ago. A friend of mine was like, "Hey, do you want to go get your palm read?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm a skeptic, but sure, I'll go get my palm read." And I had the experience, and it was what it was. But then very shortly after, like 2 weeks later, another friend of me had said he was getting into feng shui. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Tell me all about it. And as he was talking, I was like, this is beginning to sound a lot like palmistry. And the two sort of domains burned a question in my head. And I think most, certainly like academics or designers would say, oh, that's just fluff and nonsense. But you have to admit that there's like millions of people who use divination techniques. And so there's something there for it. And I began to sort of lean into and pursue and try and answer the question, well, what is there? If I don't believe in any sort of supernatural angle to those things, what is the driving mechanism and how deeply can you uncover it? But I think most people, when they hear, oh, I've done some semiotic analysis and design analysis of like tarot, would go like, what? So if I have any unique insight, it's probably from a willingness to look in those weird oubliettes.
Great, I love that. Question three, why this of all things? Why do you do what you do?
Mm, I, I'll tell a story. Um, Way back in undergraduate, I was studying graphic design and I was working my way through it. I didn't have like a full scholarship or anything. And I had gotten a class that fit my schedule in the evenings. I showed up and um, I hadn't done my due diligence to sign up for the class early, so I was hoping to get into the class the night it started.
Hmm.
And there were about 20 other people who had the exact same idea. So it was a class on Photoshop, and I already knew Photoshop. I was doing it as part of my job that was getting me through college. Um, But I kept that kind of hidden because I needed the related arts credit, and put my name into a on a slip of paper that the professor was drawing out of a bowl to see who would get in the class. And fortunately, Ed Hill was the professor's name. Ed pulled my name out of that hat. And afterwards, after everyone left, I was like, I like Ed, I kind of already know Photoshop, so like, what else can I do in this time? This is when I can do it. And he said, well, there are a couple of grad students in the back studying what we called at the time multimedia. He was like, you want to join them? And I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I loved that semester
Mm,
of getting into this new medium. So I signed up for the second semester much more deliberately and, in advance this time to do more in that vein. But so did the other students, the other grad students. And Ed saw this and he was like, okay, hang on. And he said, before I will admit you to this second semester, you need to write an essay for me that explains to me why you're here and what you hope to get out of it. And to some extent, it felt a little bit like a challenge and a little bit like busy work. But I actually threw myself into this question, like why? What intrigued me about this? And the pith of that essay that I submitted, and I no longer have it, but I do remember it. And I said that this was the next new thing, the next big, hard problem that we as designers, we as even our culture are trying to figure out. And I want to be there. I want to help figure it out.
mm,
And that that was true then, and it's true now. That question led me from graphic design into interaction design because I was like, graphic design is mature, but interaction design is this big new field. And even 10 years ago, shifting into designing for AI, it was the next big new hard problem. And whatever comes next for me, I'm sure it's going to be wrapped around that same question.
mm. Perfect. Number four, some people struggle with, and the question is, what does your future look like?
I wouldn't say I'll struggle with the question, but it's certainly had you asked me this question a month ago, it would be different than today, because about a month ago, I got named as one of the 9,000 employees who were laid off from IBM. So even in my intro, you were like, Chris is a design principal, and that was true. But I am, as literally as of today, this is my first day post IBM.
Mm,
I don't have a next thing lined up. So my current plan is to get back on schedule with my next book. Like when you write a book, you kind of make an agreement on when chapters are due, and that had been falling behind because of the layoff. So I'm going to use some of my post time in order to get this next book written up and to my editor, and then do some side projects. But what comes after that is wide open. I kind of have half a mind to get my doctorate, but with two kids who are youngish, I'll probably wind up at some larger firm where I can continue working on this new big next problem, which is how do we design for something like artificial intelligence and make it usable and humane and augmenting humans as opposed to replacing them.
great. Five we say is unique to this show. The question is, let's talk about location. How does the notion of place play into what you do?
It was an interesting one because I'm not an architect. I am a fan of Christopher Alexander,
Mm,
who and his pattern languages. And I read that pattern language series, those three books, uh, front front, cover to cover.
mhm,
So I'm familiar with some of the concepts from architecture, at least from that perspective. Um, and one of the concepts from architecture that I adored, and it changed the way I started looking at the places around me, was that of site specificity.
mm,
So, and again, forgive me, I'm a dilettante when it comes to architecture, but if I understand the concept right, it's like if you're building a new building in a neighborhood, you could sort of just build it with your sense of personal aesthetics and what you want to make. But the thing you're going to make is going to kind of stick out from the environment. And if you're, Frank Gehry, that may be fine. That may be what the building needs. But most of the time, the architect ought to pay attention to what's in the neighborhood, what are the materials being used, what are the architectural styles, and not take that as marching orders, but to understand that this is the palette in which your building needs to exist and to become part of that fabric and acknowledge that fabric. And so that sense of site specificity, I worked to try and understand how that plays out in the world of software design like a long time ago. Um, and understanding that, yes, there are best practices. Yes, there are psychological principles for how you should design in software, but you need to pay attention to your particular users and their particular domain and with their particular offering. And those things may challenge what you think of as best practices and what it is you ought to do.
Great. Six, if you had to start from the beginning, what advice would you give your former younger self?
This one was fairly easy to answer. If I could, I would grab me by the shoulders, I would look me in the eyes, and I would say, having good boundaries does not make you a jerk. And even let me add to that. If it did make you a jerk, sometimes being a jerk is 100% warranted. That was a lesson that, like, I don't know why, but I had a really hard time internalizing over my young adulthood. And now I've got it. Now I have a good vocabulary word for it and a good practice around it.
Great. And what's a day in your life like?
Uh, well, certainly day in the life about a month ago would have been a little bit different. Do you want me to answer for what a day in my life was while I was doing the design principle stuff at IBM, or what it is like today, or what I expect it to be over the next couple of months?
Let's try the first two. Let's try both.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Well, while I was at IBM, I'd often wake up early in the morning because it was a very international company. So I would have meetings with Indian and European colleagues, and that often meant early California time. So very late in India and late-ish in Europe. Then on sort of odd days, I might be taking my kids to school. Uh, then in the mornings, I would be doing one of a series of projects. I ran a big community of practice called the Design for AI Guild at IBM. And so I would, and that entailed a whole bunch of sub projects, each of which may entail even further sub projects. So I would be looking through my task list about, okay, what is the big picture? What comes next? What are my next hard deadline? And what is my next big arc deadline? And working some of those projects, often having some meetings with folks. Um, if I had an hour at lunch, I'd try and run to the gym. Uh, I would in the afternoon, early afternoon, I would catch up on industry news. I try and parse it because I try to be omnivorous about that kind of thing and say, okay, well, what of this matters to me and my colleagues? And then sharing that back out with them on whatever platform merits it. Could be an email. Most often at IBM, it was a Slack message to a particular group. And then talking about it and then trying to make sense about it and connecting it to the world. And AI is certainly a very fast-paced domain, so that could change very often.
Mm.
Um, then in my afternoons, um, if I could, I would take time on more longer term projects, like writing books or writing articles or taking a big, as broad a perspective as I could, while still bringing the concepts down to some real world, here and now utility. Um, Evenings that I would have to go on even days, go pick up my kids from school and start the whole evening routine of dinner and bedtime stories and that sort of stuff.
Mm. Great. Okay, and number eight, lifelong learning is a popular topic. How do you stay up to date?
It's it's funny the framing of this question, partially because my grad thesis was about designing a service for lifelong learners.
Mhm.
I did that about 20-ish years ago. So I'm very glad to hear that lifelong learning is still of interest, especially in the age of AI. Like we have to stay nimble and we have to stay informed. But to answer your question, there are two ways that I stay up to date. The first is I've subscribed. and unsubscribe to a lot of newsletters until I have a small list of newsletters that I like and trust. So I will read them fairly diligently. Depends on how thick my schedule is on a given day. But like MIT Tech Reviews, The Algorithm is one that I love. The Rundown AI, which had a name change, and I can't remember the old name of that. SIG Chi is a big computation organization, and their I2K Connect newsletter is a good one. And then a fourth one that I pay attention to is the Deep View. But it's important to know that if you're only getting your news from newsletters, then you're relying on other people's parsing of that information. And even more so, you're reading what everyone else is reading. So in addition to that, I drag a couple of agents into the picture. So I have Google Alerts set up for keywords that I think are cutting edge or adjacent to my topics. And so they will come into my inbox as well when a news item or a blog post or something comes out related to those keywords. And I'll check those out as well. And that's a lot more hit or miss, as you might imagine, because it's uncurated, but it helps me feel like I'm paying attention to early signals, not sort of safe, certain signals.
Hmm. Great. 9 is about tools. Can you talk about your use of digital and or analog tools?
Yeah, totally. I don't use a lot of analog tools, but I am a very visual thinker. So a lifelong doodler. I've kept to-do lists, to-do lists in some kind of visual format since I was an undergrad. And so to do that, I have an iPad Pro and I use GoodNotes all the time. So I write mind maps out of things that I'm writing or things that I'm working on, things that I'm thinking about. I use it to sketch note things I'm reading or to draw out hand drawn interfaces on that sort of first take of them. And then, of course, I'll move into some more familiar tools like Figma or the Adobe Suite. Lately, I've added Claude.ai as a sometimes tool when I need support. But I'm trying to be very diligent about not being over reliant, not being a sucker about that information. And of course, with all the public speaking I do, a lot of times the end result of a lot of those things come into Keynote, where I can, make rich presentations to share out what I'm thinking or what I know in ways that are engaging for people.
Perfect. And halfway number 10, how do you deal with work life or life work balance?
I like that you swap either. Like, who knows which comes first? I would like to say life work balance, the second one. Um, there are two ways that I could think of, and here I'm thinking about the last two roles that I've had. And part one is I mention it upfront in interviews. So I work at large organizations. They have the scope to enable me to focus really deeply. But by mentioning it up front in the interview and getting some clarity around it, I can kind of use my, bullshit detector to say whether there is any sense of life work balance at this particular organization. And that can be a filtering factor, and whether or not I'm going to accept the job. But also because it sets up that conversation, quite frankly, so that later when you, and this is part two, people begin to try and encroach on that, you can be really clear. Well, I talked about it during the course of the interview, and I'm going to hold this boundary really firmly. And sometimes, you can't help it. You have to be up late for a call with some other part of the world, or if I'm presenting at a virtual conference halfway around the world, yes, I'm going to be up late, but I'll be very frank with my colleagues and saying, hey, I worked late last night, so I'm going to be coming in a little later today, and I'll use that time to do something like, I don't know, go to the gym or um, reading, spending a little more time reading the incoming stuff.
Hmm. Great. And if you weren't doing what you do now, what might you be doing?
Well, of course, today is an odd day to be asking that question because what am I doing now? I'm just writing a book, but as opposed to work. There are probably two versions of the answer to this question. Um, the first is like if money were no object, I think I could either be well, I would love to return to working in a museum. I worked for a science museum for years and years and years and years, and I love not years, that's exaggeration, for about 2 years, and I loved it. But it very much stayed with me as like, okay, how do you make big concepts accessible in interactive ways to the general public? That was a thrilling job for me. Um, but it, as you might imagine, doesn't pay very well. And similarly, I think I would make a pretty good professor. I've taught a number of times across my career, though I'm not sure I'm well suited for the politics of a real learning institution. I understand there's a lot, and boy, howdy, that just doesn't fit my character. And a third answer is one that I love this cocktail conversation. Like if civilization collapses and you didn't have a computer to work on, what would you do? And I think I would want to be a printer and bookbinder,
Mm.
partially because I did bookbinding as an undergrad. I did a lot of printing as related arts in my undergraduate. I just loved it. And printing is a thing that has been in my family for a number of generations. My uncle, who just recently passed, and even the forefather who brought my surname to the United States, what brought the first printing press to Texas via Corpus Christi. So I've got some uh, family momentum that I could take advantage of in order to do that. Who knows? Maybe I'll wind up doing that in my retirement.
Love that. What would you not like to do with your career?
That's a weighty question. AI, of course, is has problems. I'm kind of a bright green fellow, if you know that metaphor, right? A person who is green about technology says, no, we can use these tools to solve problems. And a
Mm.
bright green person who says, no, I believe that we can use, they're optimistic about using these tools to solve problems. But I'm not, I know that there are problems with it, and I want to not exacerbate the problems that we have, right? Inequality and injustice is big in the world. AI could, if mishandled or serving the wrong interests, exacerbate those problems. I have turned down work and turned down jobs to help the ultra wealthy and powerful become more wealthy and powerful. I have no interest in that. I don't want to further the causes of fascism or oligarchy in the world. Like we're already suffering enough. And it's kind of on a bender right now. So on reflection, this seems like a sort of like a laundry list of progressive political things. But honestly, I believe all these things, and I hope as I look for a next position and next stage for my career, to avoid those things because I just don't want to do it.
Grade N13. Do you have a favorite word, quote, or sentence?
I do. I'm a huge fan of Marshall McLuhan and a lot of the thinkers from the 1950s. I think they were very influential, but McLuhan more than anyone. Huge insights, way ahead of his time. And I think one of the quotes from him that opened up my mind and that I love to share with other people in the hopes that they can have their mind similarly opened is, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. That's mind expanding and invites a kind of literacy in the relationship between ourselves and our tools and our media that few other quotes can.
Great. And how about a least favorite word, quote, or sentence?
There's a quote. I've seen it come across social media a number of times, and it just makes me crazy. Uh, and it comes in various formats, but insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That just on the face of it, it is not true. That is not what insanity is. And B, there are so many examples of things where you do the same thing over and over again, and you do get different results. So like it's stupid on the face of it. It's stupid when you think deeply about it. And every time I see it shared, I groan and I'm like, all right, who shared this? And I pass judgment on them.
Nice. You're choosing one word to describe yourself. What word do you choose?
I'm going to borrow a word from a good friend of mine and one of my favorite thinkers, as a fellow by the name of Jonathan Corman, who introduced me to the word perspicacity. And I didn't know what it meant when he first used it. And so I asked him, Jonathan, what the heck does that mean? And it means ready insight when faced with complex problems. And when I turned that word over in my head, I was like, that definitely fits Jonathan. And I feel like it fits me So I would say perspicacious.
Great. And what keeps you up at night?
Well, in the bigger context of the world, right? I live in America and we're dealing with some fascism. So like one thing that's keeping me up at night is when and if it becomes time to leave or whether to stay and fight the good fight. But the answer to that question is certainly informed by the fact that I've got young kids. And I'm thinking, yes, about my future and about the future of the country, but about their future in particular. But in the context of my profession, the thing that keeps me up at night is about AI. Am I am I kidding myself that it can be used for good purposes, or whether it's so problematic that I'm either kidding myself or fighting an uphill Sisyphean battle in trying to make it humane, in trying to work on AI for good.
Great. And final stretch here. What's a dream you're chasing?
I mentioned Tarot earlier in our questions, and that 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 palm reading invitation came over 30 years ago. And probably about 30 years ago, I was like, you know what? I want to find somebody who's written this book, and nobody did. At least I haven't been able to find it in the 30 years since. It's like, okay, I'm going to write this book. But it's been 30 years in the making, and that is a very long time. But part of what has taken so long is that to write a book about meaning making through randomness, I want to do some semiotic analysis of some of those tools like Tarot or the I Ching or Haruspication or, name them. But to do the semiotic analysis of that is a massive undertaking. I did it by hand. Well, not by hand. I wrote a computer program that helped me do it about 3 years ago. No, it's 2020, so 5 years ago, for Tarot. And it took me like 2 months of doing nothing else on the side but hand coding this like at night and on the weekends. And I could not bring myself to do it again. And large language models and AIs like Claude.ai have just gotten to the point where they're able to help me do that in a way that I might be able to do over the course of a week rather than, 2 months of my life. So if that is true, and I recently ran a test, and I'm now writing the tools that'll help me test the output of the AI to know whether I can trust it. If it is, then I can finish that book, write it, write the engine for the randomness that will help generate the the end result book that gets printed, and then get that out into the world. Like of all the weird ideas I've had in my life, that I think is the one that is the most esoteric and the most out of the blue and sort of the most I mentioned the oubliette earlier, that place that people don't want to think about, but there's great insight to be had there. So I have a dream of finishing this project, and the notion that I've been moving it forward as I can for 30 years and getting it finished would be a fantastic thing to have gotten out in the world and leave as a weird legacy.
Mm, great. And 18, what inspires you?
When I originally thought about the answer to this question, I was like, oh, it's stuff that combines deep insight and elegant presentations and a really good hook, and work that is like bigger than the here and now. I wrote for a website for a time called Everything Two, which is kind of like a first person Wikipedia. And one of the principles that the writers of that site that contribute to that site try to adhere to is to write for the 10,000 years. And that's obviously sounds sort of Tao Te Ching-ish, but it's really like don't write about something that can easily be forgotten in the next couple of months. Try and think about something that might be relevant 100 years from now, or at least pay some attention to the thing that's happening right now in the context of what it might mean in 100 years from now. And I think that is uh, probably the thing that most inspires me is when I can read something or see something that where somebody has done that. So like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, or Douglas Hofstadter's Goodlesher and Bach, or McLuhan's The Medium is the Massage, is a radio play that he did based on his book, The Medium is the Message. And all of those are examples of that sort of insight, presentation, great hook, and huge perspective.
Great. And last couple here, number 19, any advice you'd like to share?
Yeah, holding boundaries does not make you a jerk. To make a call back to my earlier statement. But if I were to avoid repeating myself from earlier in the interview, I think to avoid the pursuit of purity. Hold on, I'm gonna answer this again, but my darling cat, my coworker, sweetheart, go, go, go. Um, if I were not to repeat myself, it's that the pursuit of purity only leads to suffering. Um, the world is complicated, and the art, the trick is to mastering that complication, not pretending it isn't there.
Great. And finally, number 20, how can our listeners keep tabs on you and what's our call to action?
I would say the call to action is to, you're now a lifelong learner. You cannot help it. The world is moving too fast to not be. Um, to keep up with me, I write very occasionally on medium.com, but that is still my preferred platform. I post to sci-fi-interfaces.com that I mentioned at the beginning. Um, and I'm an infrequent publisher on those platforms, especially while I'm working on a book. But I also publish stuff specifically around design for AI on LinkedIn occasionally. But the good news is my name is globally unique, so it is super easy to find me using any available search engine.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on today. It's a real privilege to have you on and real glad you're here. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Thomas. It was good talking with you.